It begins with a whisper, a voice carried on the wind through empty hallways of a house long abandoned, where sunlight never reaches the corners and the walls seem to remember everything. For centuries, this family's name has been buried beneath layers of shame, fear, and silence, a name that, if spoken aloud, brings a shiver to those who stumble upon it. You might think history is a neutral collection of dates and names, but some legacies are darker than the ink that records them. Some bloodlines carry a weight that can't be explained by luck, circumstance, or fate. This is the story of one such lineage, cursed, hidden, and feared for generations. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The story starts in a quiet corner of early America, a place untouched by the sweeping hand of progress, where neighbors whispered and watched, and doors were kept firmly shut. The family in question was outwardly ordinary farmers, merchants, people who belonged to no notable rank. But beneath the mundane exterior there was a thread of darkness weaving through their generations. A compulsion, a madness, a secret sickness that seemed to pass from parent to child like a shadow refusing to die. Letters, diaries, and town records, once innocuous, reveal glimpses of abnormal unions, strange behaviors, and tragedies so repeated that even the most skeptical of historians might wonder if fate itself had turned its eye upon them. By the early 1800s, the whispers had grown louder. Neighbors began to notice patterns. No one dared to name children born with uncanny resemblances to their ancestors, illnesses that defied reason, accidents that always seemed to strike the same family. And yet, no one dared investigate too closely. The fear was subtle but pervasive, a fear that the very act of acknowledging the family's existence might awaken something better left forgotten. Town meetings were hushed, gossip was clipped, yet the records remained, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to uncover them. What makes this bloodline particularly chilling is not just the repetition of misfortune, but the almost ritualistic secrecy surrounding it. Every generation seemed to know its own history, but never to speak of it. Children learned early that certain rooms were forbidden, certain books should never be touched, and certain questions must never be asked. And so the cycle continued, quietly, invisibly, as if the house itself conspired to guard its dark legacy. Tonight, we are breaking that silence. Tonight, we are stepping inside a history that was never meant to be told. What you are about to hear is not legend, not myth, but documented, irrefutable evidence of a family that the world forgot, yet whose shadow lingers still. From the first spark of this curse to the echoes it left on modern descendants, the story will chill you, haunt you, and perhaps make you wonder how much of history is safe to uncover, and how much is better left buried. This is the most cursed bloodline in history, and this is the story that hides behind its carefully closed doors. The origins of this bloodline are shrouded in mystery, hidden behind the fading ink of colonial records and the charred pages of old journals. What we do know is that the family arrived in America quietly, like shadows slipping through a gate, bringing with them a legacy that had long been whispered about in their homeland. The first generation in this new world seemed unremarkable at first glance. Farmers, craftsmen, the kind of people who built towns without fanfare. But even then, subtle patterns emerged. Neighbors recalled children who were unusually withdrawn, who spoke to themselves in a language no one else understood, or who seemed to anticipate misfortune before it arrived. As the family grew, so did the weight of its secret. Records show marriages between cousins, closely knit unions that were frowned upon even in an age when distant relatives often married. Some historians have speculated that these arrangements were purely practical, designed to consolidate wealth or property. But when you trace the lineage, the results are unsettling. Children were born with physical anomalies, mental instability, and tendencies toward violence that seemed almost inevitable, as if each generation inherited not just genes but a dark fate encoded into their very blood. One of the earliest chroniclers, a minister who kept meticulous diaries, described the family in terms that hint at fear rather than scorn. He wrote of a young girl who would disappear into the woods for hours, only to return with a knowledge of things she could not possibly have learned. He wrote of a boy who, by the age of 12, seemed to understand the tragedies of death better than any adult. And he wrote of an unease that permeated the house itself, a heaviness that could be felt by anyone who stepped over its threshold. These weren't isolated observations, they were repeated decade after decade across generations. It is tempting to dismiss such accounts as superstition, as the exaggerated storytelling of small-town chroniclers. But then the medical records appear, scribbled notes from local doctors, records of births and deaths that are impossible to ignore. They show unusually high rates of deformities, mental illness, and premature deaths, all confined to this single family. Even strangers who married into the bloodline seem to inherit misfortune, their lives entangled with a pattern that could not be explained by coincidence alone. By the mid-19th century, the family had become a cautionary tale whispered in nearby towns. Visitors reported an eerie presence when passing by the property, doors that slammed for no reason, unexplained illnesses, children who spoke of voices guiding them, and livestock that died under strange circumstances. Yet inside the family, life went on as if nothing were unusual, the curse internalized, acknowledged only in the silent fear each member carried. This is not just a story of tragedy, it is a story of inevitability. Each generation, unknowingly or unwillingly, participated in a cycle that seemed predetermined, a dark inheritance that no one could escape. And while the outside world whispered and turned away, the family continued, carrying its secret quietly from one century into the next, until it could no longer remain hidden. By the turn of the 20th century, the bloodline had grown both in numbers and in infamy, though the world at large remained largely unaware of its dark reputation. The family's property had expanded into a sprawling homestead, its boundaries marked not just by fences but by unspoken rules of fear. Outsiders were rarely welcomed, and when they were, they noticed a subtle but pervasive unease, a sense that something vital had been deliberately withheld from view. The children, raised in near total isolation, were taught to fear the world beyond the homestead as much as they feared the shadows within it. Letters from distant relatives suggest that attempts to intervene were met with resistance, often violent. There were reports of relatives who tried to take children away, only for them to vanish, reappearing weeks later with no explanation. The family maintained an almost ritualistic control over its environment. Bedrooms were assigned not by age or gender alone, but by lineage, with certain children confined to rooms passed down through generations. Diaries from the era hint at strange practices, whispered lessons in secret languages, obscure prayers, and an almost obsessive cataloging of ancestry. Every child seemed to be educated not only in reading and writing, but in the meticulous understanding of their own heritage and the weight of its curse. Medical records from local practitioners reveal a haunting consistency: recurring illnesses, premature deaths, mental instability. One doctor, who practiced in the area for decades, noted that the family presented symptoms he had never seen in anyone else. Children who were physically healthy could suddenly succumb to fevers that defied treatment. Others exhibited compulsive behaviors that were strikingly similar across generations. These were not coincidences, he wrote, but patterns that demanded explanation. Yet no one could fully articulate what lay behind them, and the family itself offered no answers. Outside the homestead, townsfolk whispered about the shadow family in hushed tones. Parents would warn children not to wander near the property. Visitors reported unexplained noises at night, lights flickering in abandoned rooms, and glimpses of children staring silently from windows as if they knew things no child should know. One account describes a traveling salesman who, upon entering the main house, felt an overwhelming sense of dread so intense that he fled without completing his business. Fear seemed to radiate from the property itself, as though the very land had absorbed the family's dark legacy. Despite this isolation, the family remained remarkably cohesive. Internal discipline was strict, and any hint of deviation from the established order was met with quiet but unmistakable consequences. Adolescents were told in no uncertain terms that their lives were bound to the past, and in this way the cycle continued. Each generation inherited not just genes but an expectation of suffering, secrecy, and vigilance, a psychological weight that was passed like a silent heirloom from parent to child. By the early 1900s, this bloodline was no longer merely a story of strange behaviors or unfortunate coincidences. It had become an intricate web of inherited darkness, a living archive of a curse that defied logic, and a lineage whose very existence challenged the notion that history is neutral. The past was not gone, it was alive, and it was watching. By the 1920s, the The family had become almost entirely self-contained, their lives governed by rules that outsiders could neither understand nor challenge. Houses were constructed not for comfort but for control. Rooms were arranged to monitor movement, hallways designed to restrict escape, and windows often shuttered to prevent the gaze of the outside world. Children were rarely allowed beyond the property line, and when they did venture out, it was under strict supervision. Every action was recorded in diaries or passed down through oral tradition, a meticulous accounting of lineage, behaviors, and, most disturbingly, transgressions. What makes this bloodline especially haunting is the way secrecy became a tool of power. Adults spoke little, but when they did, it was always in cryptic warnings, half-truths, or silent glances. The children learned early that questions were dangerous, curiosity was a threat to survival, and so generations were raised in a state of suspended fear, carrying knowledge they did not fully understand, yet sensing its weight at every turn. One account describes a boy who, at 7 years old, knew to avoid certain rooms not because of rules, but because he could feel the presence of something lurking there. He called it the Watcher, a presence that seemed to reside in the walls themselves. Medical histories from the era continue to paint a grim picture. Illnesses appeared with uncanny regularity, fevers that defied treatment, unexplained injuries, and patterns of mental instability that mirrored previous generations. Even those who married into the family were not spared. Outsiders found their lives entwined in misfortune that seemed to manifest almost immediately upon joining the household. Town doctors and clergy who attempted to intervene eventually withdrew, often citing that the family's conditions were beyond natural understanding. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the personal diaries of family members themselves. In them, they describe dreams and visions of past relatives, warnings, and tragedies yet to come. They write of a sense of inevitability, as if their lives were already charted before birth. One entry reads, simply, "We are cursed, and we know it." Such statements are repeated across decades, as if each generation is silently acknowledging a heritage too terrible to escape. By the mid-20th century, the family's presence had become almost mythical in the surrounding area. Stories of strange lights in windows, unexplained sounds at night, and children who seemed impossibly wise, or impossibly haunted, were passed from neighbor to neighbor. Few dared approach, and fewer still ever spoke with them directly, and yet, behind closed doors, life continued in its darkly ritualized fashion, births, deaths, and marriages all occurring within the same carefully controlled lineage. The curse, whatever its nature, persisted, its mechanisms invisible to outsiders, yet unmistakable to those living within its shadow. What emerges from this period is a portrait of a family trapped in a web of its own making, bound by blood, fear, and secrecy. They are not merely tragic, they are a living testament to the way a lineage can become its own prison. And as we follow their story into the later 20th century, we begin to see the full weight of the darkness they inherited, a darkness that refuses to die quietly. By the 1950s and 60s, the family had become nearly invisible to the outside world, a ghostly presence remembered only in rumor and hushed warnings. The property remained secluded, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to shield the household from prying eyes. Locals spoke of strange occurrences, shadows moving behind curtained windows, children with an uncanny understanding of events before they happened, and a quiet, almost mechanical repetition of rituals that outsiders could never decipher. The family had learned to survive in a world that feared them, and in doing so, they had transformed isolation into a weapon, reinforcing the boundaries between themselves and the outside. The psychological toll on family members was immense, though rarely acknowledged. Diaries, letters, and oral histories suggest a constant state of internal surveillance, each individual monitored by both parents and siblings. Mistakes were not simply reprimanded, they were cataloged, recorded, and remembered as cautionary examples. In this way, fear was institutionalized within the household. Children grew up knowing they were born into a cycle of suffering that no act of defiance could escape. And as these children matured, they too assumed the role of guardians, enforcing the unspoken laws of the bloodline with the same quiet intensity learned from their forebears. Medical records and oral accounts continue to reveal a disturbing pattern. Physical deformities, mental illnesses, and premature deaths persisted with almost ritualistic regularity. Even marriages outside the family rarely diluted the legacy. Outsiders often found themselves entangled in tragedies that mirrored those of the bloodline. Some historians suggest that what we are seeing is not merely genetic predisposition, but the psychological imprint of generations conditioned to expect and perpetuate suffering. In this context, the curse is as much learned behavior as it is inherited biology. By this point, the family had begun to attract the attention of a few daring historians and journalists, though access was nearly impossible. One researcher, granted temporary entry into the main house, described an environment, frozen in time, yet alive with the weight of 100 tragedies. Rooms were filled with old journals, letters, and artifacts documenting decades of suffering. Meticulously preserved, the sense of inevitability was overwhelming. Every object seemed to whisper the same warning: the past cannot be escaped. It is during this era that the family's story becomes almost unbearable to recount. The cumulative effect of centuries of secrecy, fear, and inherited misfortune had created individuals simultaneously aware of and trapped by their lineage. Dreams, visions, and a heightened intuition of danger became part of everyday life. Some members described seeing figures from previous generations in mirrors, feeling presences in empty rooms, or hearing voices that imparted knowledge of past and future tragedies. This is not folklore. These accounts are recorded in personal writings passed down to modern descendants and corroborated by the few outsiders who managed to witness them. And so, by the middle of the 20th century, the bloodline had become more than a family. It had become a living archive of pain, a cautionary tale of inherited darkness, and a reminder that some histories are too heavy for the human soul. Their story was still hidden from the world, yet it persisted, waiting for someone willing, or foolish enough, to uncover it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? As the decades passed into the late 20th century, the family's presence became even more enigmatic, their history buried beneath layers of secrecy that even modern researchers struggled to penetrate. Public records grew sparse, intentionally obscured or destroyed, and the homestead itself seemed to shrink from the outside world, as though the land were swallowing it whole. Yet the bloodline persisted, carrying with it the weight of its centuries-old curse. New generations were born into the same cycles of secrecy, fear, and inherited misfortune, never fully aware of the breadth of the darkness that had preceded them. Accounts from surviving members describe a strange duality in their lives. On one hand, there was the mundane, the routine of farming, schooling, or local work. On the other, there was the relentless awareness of something unseen pressing upon them, guiding choices, dictating interactions, and enforcing the invisible rules of the bloodline. Some children learned early that even small missteps could provoke long-term consequences. Obedience was survival. The lessons they inherited were not written in books but etched into their very consciousness, a subtle and insidious form of psychological conditioning passed down through generations. Medical and anecdotal evidence from this era continues to mirror the troubling patterns of the past. Children suffered unexplained illnesses, mental instability remained prevalent, sometimes manifesting as extreme anxiety, depression, or erratic behavior. Those who married into the family often found themselves caught in patterns of tragedy almost immediately. There are accounts of spouses who vanished mysteriously, accidents that defied explanation, and misfortunes that seemed to shadow every decision. The curse, whatever its nature, was not simply genetic. It had become a lived experience, a tangible weight that each member carried daily. Despite the isolation, a few outsiders managed to interact with the family, offering glimpses into their world. One journalist who spent time with them described a household frozen in ritual, with a reverence for ancestry that bordered on obsession. Every object, every photograph, every diary seemed to serve as a reminder of the family's history, a history steeped in misfortune and whispered warnings. Visitors reported a pervasive unease, as if the house itself were aware of their presence, watching, evaluating, silently judging. And yet, even in the modern era, the family's story remained largely untold. The outside world knew little, and those who attempted to dig deeper were met with silence or subtle intimidation. What emerges from the fragments that survive is a portrait of a lineage trapped in time, its members both victims and keepers of a curse that refuses to fade. The darkness inherited by this bloodline is not a simple tale of misfortune, it is a complex, living entity growing stronger with every generation, silently shaping lives from birth. This is a family whose story challenges our understanding of history, heredity, and human endurance. It is a reminder that some legacies are too heavy to bear, and some truths are too disturbing to confront. Yet they persist, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to uncover them. By the early 21st century, the family had become almost mythic, a name spoken only in whispers and cautious speculation. Modern technology and genealogical tools offered glimpses into their lineage, yet every attempt to trace the family fully only deepened the sense of unease. Digital records, photographs, and DNA tests revealed the same patterns seen for centuries: interwoven relationships, repeated misfortunes, and a persistent thread of psychological and physical anomalies that defied explanation. It was as if the curse had adapted to the modern world, invisible yet unbroken. Descendants who survived outside the immediate homestead carried the legacy quietly. Some tried to escape it, relocating to distant cities, changing names, marrying outsiders, but the pattern seemed to follow them. Reports describe a haunting familiarity, children exhibiting traits long associated with the family, recurring illnesses, and a subtle but undeniable pull towards secrecy and isolation. Even in a world connected by the internet and modern medicine, the bloodline's influence remained, a chilling testament to the endurance of inherited darkness. What is most disturbing is the psychological imprint that persists across generations. Those who know of their heritage speak of anxiety and almost instinctive wariness of certain people or places, and vivid dreams of ancestors long dead. Some describe hearing voices in moments of solitude, or sensing presences that others cannot perceive. It is as if the family's history has become embedded in the mind itself, a continuous echo of generations past. Psychologists who have studied the few willing descendants speak of a pervasive trauma that cannot be explained by environment alone, an inherited burden that shapes thought, emotion, and behavior. Yet, even amid this haunting continuity, fragments of normal life persist. There are marriages, children, careers, moments of happiness, but always shadowed by the past. Birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings are tinged with an unspoken tension, a careful choreography to avoid awakening the darker threads of the lineage. Objects, traditions, and even stories are preserved with meticulous care, as though forgetting a single detail might allow the curse to spread unchecked. In this way, the family functions almost as both custodian and victim of its own history. Today, the most cursed bloodline in history is not merely a relic of the past, it is a living, breathing reality. It reminds us that some histories are too dangerous to ignore, that the past never truly dies, and that blood carries memory in ways science and reason cannot fully explain. We are left to confront an unsettling truth even centuries later. The shadows of this family stretch long and wide, touching lives far beyond the boundaries of the homestead where it all began. The story of this bloodline is not just a cautionary tale, it is a warning. Some legacies are meant to remain hidden, some truths are meant to stay buried, yet human curiosity has a way of digging where it should not. And tonight you have dug with us,